Kela Kestal Natamute. Greetings, all my relatives. Numwiyut. Those are ancient Kwakwala words spoken only by about 50 fluent speakers now. And it's almost distinct because of the kind of racism that existed in this country when the first migrants came from Europe and began to develop this wonderful place. Numwiyut. For something as simple and profound as that, and impactful, how is it that we have not been able to hold on to that idea that all of us are one? It's such a simple idea, and yet we can't hold on to it. I just wanted to start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations here. They've been so generous. They've been here forever. Their ancestors, their spirits overlay this land for thousands of years. And their descendants welcome us and are still seeking to have better relationships with all of us. I think that's generous and kind. And those should be attributes that we, all of us as Canadians, embrace and to hold and to practice every day in our lives. I want to thank Success for inviting me today. Success has done so much good work in this area, and we need this kind of work and this thought-provoking kind of dialogue and gathering that we have today more than ever before. If you can sense the kind of global discourse that's emerging that isn't based on the values and principles that we embrace as Canadians. So everybody, absolutely everybody in this room is important. You have something to do with this issue, and you can make some kind of difference in how we try to resolve all of the things that become abusive and hurtful to us. Because if you hurt one group, you're eventually going to be hurting all of us as Canadians. Our sense of being and who we are becomes denigrated if we allow groups to hate other groups and we don't stand up for each other. And so you have to know that the quality of life in our country really rests with all of you, how you live out your lives every day, at home, at work, at play. It is so important to get involved, get your mindset engaged. Don't let government do it. Don't let the experts do it. There are no others who can be practitioners except you. And so don't preempt yourself from the idea that all of us can contribute to the kind of country we want that lives up to its values. The history of immigration in Canada is actually startling. It is so imbued with the racism that we've been talking about. And we have some classic examples that were mentioned earlier about the Chinese head tax and the Japanese internment camps, Coromandel, Maru, a Doukhobor situation. If we are not diligent, those things can happen again. And that's why I'm so happy that you're here. I'm so pleased that you care enough to spend some of your time here today hearing and talking about this very important issue about who we are. I like to start always by asking an audience that I speak to, who are we in this room? Who are we? Have we examined that? Who are you? Why are you here? Because we're not going to be able to move forward with answers until we respond to those two basic questions. We're not going to see the resolutions until we respond to those, and then we start to work together to define how we move forward together. So you're absolutely important. One of the things that I've learned here in Vancouver and British Columbia, Canada, actually, is that the first people had the first of all of the racism that ever began to flood in from around the globe. Everybody who came, every color, every race, every creed, there was racism emanating from those groups because of the status we found ourselves here in Canada. So I'm really happy that I was invited here. It would be not a complete forum if you didn't ask an Aboriginal to come and speak about what we think racism is and how we can respond to it. After all, we're sort of born into it. Can you imagine being born into racism? Of being a child and being stripped of your identity, your language, and sense of value and worth, and you grow up in this beautiful country and you're never good enough because of the racism? And so my interest is in making sure that none of your children, all the races here, none of your children suffer the way that little Aboriginal children suffered in this country and are still suffering. There were so many things that made that happen. Complacency on the part of the people who came, government policy, government legislation, and all that has happened now. But we have come to this moment in our history where we can begin to reflect on what has happened between us all, and what's important is how we define what the future likes for all of us, all Canadians. In this moment, this historical moment, we have this opportunity together, like forums here, to reflect on who you are and who are we, and what is it that we're going to do to shift the perspectives that have caused great harm and despair for various people in our society. And nobody, I'm going to keep coming back to this theme, nobody has more influence and power than you in shifting this general malaise in our society that allows us to look the other way when racism is practiced, or bullying, or all of those things that take away from our human dignity. And I look at you and I see the hope and wonder and the possibility of us changing the way things are. And it's selfish too. In my own lifetime, I've been very hurt, and my children and those children after me have been very harmed and hurt, and none of us ever feel as good as you are. For some reason, the color of the Aboriginal skin in some way results in deeper racism. And so what happens is so many people come from around the world, and I imagine they come with good intentions and sense of equality and acceptance, but soon we're all like the other Canadians. This sense of racism and intolerance begins to develop. And so Aboriginal people still find themselves in this very, very difficult situation. But more than anything else, I think we have a message that Canadians need to hear, that Canadians need to respond to. And it is this, that we are in this time and potential for reconciliation. I think that as individuals in this room, as community, as family, all of us need to consider the idea that we have to live out lives that are reconciled in every way possible, emotionally, spiritually, physically, economically, And we need to work at that. And one of the other things I want to mention is that very few human beings escape trauma. All of us, at one point or another in our lives, are going to suffer trauma. Your wife may have left you, or your oldest son may have died, or you're deeply disappointed about something else. Those are trauma moments that we need to address, because if we don't address trauma, it's an unreconciled, festering issue that begins to negate how we act as human beings. And so when I'm talking about reconciliation, I'm talking about not only in the context of all of us together, but in your own lives and in your own families and your own communities. And if you can work that out, there's only one way to work that out, and it's to have honest, open, deep dialogue. Listen like you've never listened before to each other. Share your stories. That's the other powerful message I have for you. Everybody on earth has a story to tell. I learned that one time watching a documentary about the elders where I come from, who were put in jail because they were caught being involved in potlatch, or spiritual ways. And finally, they all ended up in court, and many of them spent 6 months in Ocala prison. And long after, when a documentary was being made, he was making the point, we all have a story to tell, and if we don't tell our stories to each other, then the understanding is going to break down. Then the level of respect is going to begin to diminish. So it's important for us at every opportunity to talk to each other about who we are. All the newcomers, you have a story. Those who came early, those who are new now, we all have a story, and the only way we're going to build resilience together is by understanding each other through having these dialogues, asking the hard questions, acknowledging what we've been responsible for that have been difficult, and then move on from there. So how do we do that? How do we begin to have these dialogues? Well, you start with yourself, of course. You do some self-talk. Ask yourself who you are, what have I done, what's my contribution, am I a racist, or how am I going to counter racism? Whatever it is that you need to do for yourself and you think about it, go and make it an action plan. Right away, this world is going to start getting better. Just because one person somewhere is going to make an action plan that's going to mitigate hatred and prejudice and discrimination and all of those things. That's why you're so important. You didn't come here just to hear any experts. Of course, you came here to hear them and to learn from it, and find out what tools you can take from this place today when you return to your homes and your workplaces and other places, and begin to counter the ugly things that happen in our society. So dialogue, deep understanding, transformative relationships take place. A few years ago, I used to go to the big high schools all around Low Mainland, New Westminster, and everywhere else, Surrey. And I was really startled. That's the second time I used that word today, startled, to discover that our young people in those big schools are already forming sort of enclaves in their minds about who they are, that they're better off to stick together and they don't trust the other groups. Well, that's wrong. That's wrong. Somehow we're creating fear among our youth far too early about who we think we are. And so you have to start at home teaching, mentoring, training your children about this idea of Namuyu, that we're all human beings, that we all have a right to be here. And I think one of the other things, I love the width and depth of the diversity here. When I see your faces and the colors and the different hairdo and different features, I get really, really excited about seeing that. I see this cacophony of humankind thinking deeply in this moment about how better we can treat each other, and we get together for this brief while and we dream and we imagine the possibility of a world without fear, without that hatred. One of the things I really hold close to my heart, saved my life actually, is when I finally, in my own life, began to love myself. I could never love anybody else before that because I didn't know how to love myself. And if you don't have it, you can't give it away. But once you find that love for yourself, it's going to become easier and easier and easier to look other people in the eyes and say, I love you. I love you. So some of these simplicity of thought and word are our greatest tool. There will always be challenges. I imagine there will always be racism, but our duty, our responsibility is to do all we can to mitigate that. A few years ago, we had a big walk here in Vancouver. 70,000 people walked in the name of reconciliation in the pouring rain. 70,000 people. I cried. I didn't know other people cared about me or other Aboriginals who went to residential schools. I saw that, 70,000 people, and I cried, and I knew then that it was possible to begin to seek roads to healing and reconciliation. It was so clear in my mind. That was the first big message. Since that time, I've been on a journey promoting healing and reconciliation. I couldn't believe it. By the way, we're going to have another walk in Vancouver soon, in a few months, 7 months, I think. I hope that all of you will be there, because we're not going to be walking in the name of reconciliation per se, but it's actually going to be including walking against the idea of racism and hatred for everybody. So love is a powerful word. Sometimes our young people, and there's so many of them in my community, taking their lives because they get disconnected and they feel unloved, and they take their own lives. And I think, gee, we just would have to find a way to be able to give expression to how we care for each other. It's so important. So what I want you to think about then, as we move and try to find ways to struggle against this terrible phenomenon of racism, think about what kind of individual plans you might have. A back pocket plan. How are you going to mitigate racism in the morning when you get up? Have this little back pocket plan. Whatever it is, do it. And it's going to allow you to consciously develop ideas around how you can help to mitigate hatred and separation and all of those bad things. You can do that. As a matter of fact, your back pocket plan, nobody else can do it for you. You do it, and all of you do it. It'll become a powerful force as we move forward together. My grandmother, she's gone for a long time now. She's my favorite hero in all the world. She used to say to me, "Kioset lagid igasa wadzid." My precious one, I am nothing. There'd be a long pause, and I'd wonder, what is my grandmother talking about? And she would say, "Kasuk yoslach," if you weren't here. And so I've taken my grandmother's message down through the years and always adopted it in my life. But I would be less without you. We would be less without each other. You can understand that. That's easy to follow. We would be less with each other. So all of us in this room need each other to continue to push forward the ideas that we have and making this a better world to live in. I just got a message that says 0 on there. So thank you for listening.